Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is great. It's great to have you here in the last day of the BSI Healthcare Week 2025 with the webinar, "The Power of In Silico Trials, AI, Innovation, and its Impact on Healthcare." I'm Lindsay Ferrari, Lead Standards Development Manager at BSI, and my standards portfolio is mainly focused on the healthcare and medical devices, and I guide standards development in emerging areas like AI and medical devices. Next slide, please. Before we start, let me share some housekeeping. So this is a listen-only webinar, as your mics and cameras will be disabled the whole time. So please submit any questions using the question button, and they will be addressed in the Q&A session. If you have any technical issues, please report them through the same question button. The webinar is being recorded, and after completing the feedback survey, BSI will provide a link to the recording. This is a CPD accredited webinar. To request your certificate, please complete the survey as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Alejandro Frangi, a leader in computational medicine in silico trials, who holds the prestigious bicentenary Turing Chair at the University of Manchester. Professor Frangi leads national initiatives like In Silico UK and the UK CERSI Advancing in Silico Medicine nationally and internationally. His research focuses on AI and in silico technologies, fostering collaboration between academia, industry, and regulators to drive healthcare innovation. He works at the intersection of computational modeling and medical science and aims to revolutionize patient care through cutting-edge technologies and interdisciplinary approaches. Welcome, Alex. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. And thanks as well to BSI for organizing this week of sessions, and in particular giving us a chance to talk about this topic of in silico regulatory evidence. So I'm going to start by saying that the main reason why we are today discussing this topic is because there's a number of aspects in terms of medical product development and the regulations of those that heavily depend on standards, and we will talk a bit about the importance of those later on in my talk. But I want to start by saying that regulatory evidence in the end is scientific evidence. It's evidence about fundamentally medical products, so either drugs or medical devices that have to normally go through a very lengthy process of R&D or the R&D life cycle, as we call it. And in order to generate this evidence, we need to provide, we have a number of models to do that. We can do bench testing, animal testing, human testing through, for instance, randomized controlled trials. And the questions fundamentally, the scientific questions we need to answer are about, is this product safe and is this product efficacious? Does it do what it has to do, and does it do it without having side effects or producing harms? And the question that we want to partly address today is, are they actually so solid as a foundation for medical product development? And what other imperatives we might need to reflect about in considering how we move forward? So to start, I want to emphasize that this is actually an area where, despite all of the best efforts from industry, from regulators, from standardization bodies, academia, we still have issues that we need to address. The implant files study in the US have shown that over a period of 10 years in the US, and just related to 10 medical products cleared by the FDA, there is still a large amount of death and serious adverse effects that we are witnessing. And this, in the particular context of the UK, is mirrored by the findings of what is called the Cumberledge report, or that is entitled "First Do Not Harm." Now, in order to address that, one of the propositions that has been put forward and that we are sort of putting to your attention today is the need to have new ways of thinking about how we develop new products, so that we can reduce the research, development, and regulation cycle from years to months, and also we can produce better safety guarantees by failing fast and failing earlier, and I would say failing safer as well. And this is where in silico or in computers testing and clinical trials comes, and is essentially the discipline of developing methods and tools and processes and standards and best practices to provide detailed prediction models, mostly based on things like computational modeling, simulation, AI, that provide highly controlled environments where we can test devices or drugs and their interactions with the patients and their interactions with clinicians, variability, for instance, learning experience in the job of treating patients, and how we relate those computational predictions ultimately with clinical outcomes that are the ones that we are interested in. And in silico, again, in computers, evidence is the evidence derived from such models. Now, this is quite important because along the life cycle of the medical products in the horizontal axis, and we show that depending on where we are in the process, there is a number of situations that we have now where new problems are detected and they need to be resolved. And currently what we do is this blue dotted line where we tend to do relatively little testing in early phases of the medical products, and then as we move to preclinical trials, clinical trials, regulatory approvals, things that could have gone wrong start going wrong. And the deeper we go into this pipeline, the more expensive it is to go back to the drawing board and correct. So what we are trying to do within Silico Technologies is create computational counterfactuals, computational scenarios in early phases of our R&D cycle that actually reflect later stage testing, diversity, and context of use and environmental conditions. So we want to do testing earlier, but reflects later stage scenarios. Now, if we were to do that, and there are pilots studies that show that this is possible, some companies have demonstrated that you could, for instance, launch a medical device up to 2 years earlier. You can reduce the amount of human testing that you need to do. And remember, a person that participates in trials is not just one-off of going one day, do a test, and they go. They need to usually be part of the trial for 3-5 years. So it's a very long-term commitment and a big interruption in the life of that individual. So if we reduce that number, we also are reducing the cost of those trials by a substantial amount. And by having gone earlier to market, we are actually able to sell much earlier a larger number of those products, which both helps to provide life-saving therapies to people faster, but also makes those businesses more sustainable. Now, we're not saying here that we need to remove the complete need of the other forms of testing that I alluded before, and that all needs to be replaced with modeling and simulation. This is, we think, far away from the reality on the relatively short term. But we do believe is that there is an ethical question of whether it is reasonable to rely on only 3 sources of evidence, and in fact you have a fourth one that actually can provide you additional insights. And how do we incorporate this in silico modeling approaches or computational modeling and simulation, CMS here in this draw, into a more integrated, proportionate, and risk-informed evidence framework that would help us to make better decisions about products. So I'm going to give you just a couple of very quick examples. There is documents that I'm listing there that you could go in detail and find really on the order of 20-25 exemplars in a number of areas. But I want to talk to one that I've been personally working in my group, where we show through a recent publication that through in silico techniques, we can actually replicate and expand the insights of 3 studies that were run before, 2 randomized controlled trials and 1 post-marketing registry, and this was in the context of low diversion devices in brain aneurysms. So we could produce that at the 5% accuracy within a fraction of the time and cost that those trials actually cost. We also there is also other colleagues from industry that have shown how you can use in silico methods to replicate replicate results of bench testing, so reducing the need for animal experiments, or for instance, in the case of these are cadaveric studies that actually have conditions of testing which are actually not necessarily related to those of real in vivo human testing, but also they are expensive and they are time consuming. And then other colleagues to show that also regulators are engaging in this dynamic. FDA in the US developed the Victor trial, which is a comparison between 2 different imaging techniques to show basically which of those has a better differential diagnostic power. Again, I'm not going into the details of those, but it's just to give you a sense of the diversity of those. Then finally, I want to have a word about the standards and the communities of practices. So if you want to get started in this area, my recommendation is to reach out to organizations like Avicenna Alliance, that is an international one based in Europe, and in Silico UK, which is sort of a branch of Avicenna Alliance that is operating within the UK, and we are looking specifically to requirements for the UK subsector. And we have a very large attention from people that have visited our webpage and a very large community of practice into a Slack workspace. And this is what led to the Center of Excellence on in silico regulatory science and innovation that I'm going to briefly talk about in a moment. So this Center of Excellence has developed over the last 3-4 years a community of practice, a community of interest that is representing different actors across the whole landscape of end users, supply chains, catalyst organizations, capital investment, funders, policymakers, regulators, trade organizations, academia, and also members of the NHS. And it's this concerted action what it will take to actually drive this forward. One specific way in which we are doing that is by working on 10 case studies that are like formulated as pre-competitive, non-commercial, but industry-driven nonetheless, or industry-inspired case studies where we are actually looking at the question of model credibility. So what does it take for a computational model to be credible enough so regulators can actually use that evidence? And a colleague of mine, Jeff Bishop, developed the next couple of slides, and he summarized here some of the standards that we have in the area of computational modeling, where some of the key concepts are defined, but also how we still have gaps that we need to be addressing. And those have gaps around ensure that the software has provided credible, objective evidence about their credibility. And there is, again, some upcoming standards that we're going to be talking a bit later on. Then FEA has developed a number of guidances, and then American organizations like the American Society of Mechanical Engineering has developed models for credibility assessment of computational models and simulation for particularly verification and validation in the context of regulatory approval processes. Sorry, I think I went to the very end by mistake. I'm really sorry for this. Yeah, so so just a gist about these different standards. They are standards that are risk informed, so they look at the influence of the models in the decision, the regulatory decision, but also what is the consequence of getting it wrong and is the combination of the model influence and the decision consequence what defines what is called the model risk. And the principle of this approach is that you need to distinguish between the reality of interest, so the thing that you're modeling, the mathematical model, which has to do more with epistemic knowledge, plus the computational model that has to do more with the way you actually implement that epistemic model into a numerical calculation, and therefore the different models, the different errors that come from these three different sources. And then the type of testing you need to do depends on the level of risks and a number of validation activities that you need to define. So this is now trying to be developed into a more global standard by the International Electrotechnical Commission, and there is a standard, an ad hoc working group that is called Ad Hoc Working Group 11 from the Technical Committee 62 on Medical Equipment, Software and Systems, that you can reach out to Lindsay for more details on how to get engaged. But colleagues like Mark Horner, Julian, and I are all members of this committee. And then finally, as conclusions, I hope I gave you a bit of a gist about how in silico methods can help to revolutionize safety and the speed of medical testing, but also how we think this can reshape the way that we do regulations and regulatory evidence in the forward. And it's key to say that this is a cross-sector effort, And that's why events like these ones are so important, and your contribution, if you're interested in this area, is so critical as well. So hopefully we will see you engage and contribute to this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's very exciting subject. And thank you for highlighting the IEC preliminary work on computational modeling. So anyone interested in joining that work, please contact us as indicated. So our next speaker is Dr. Julian Paget, reader in computer science at the University of Bath. His research covers a range of topics in AI, with pure AI work on intelligent agents, policy modeling and reasoning, and software engineering for socio-technical systems, and multidisciplinary AI work in life sciences, social policy, mechanical and electrical engineering. He is the AI innovation theme lead at the UKRI Centre of Doctoral Training on Accountable, Responsible and Transparent Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Paget also contributes to national and international AI-related standardization activities at BSI, CEN, ISO, IEC, and he's also an editor and contributing author to the United Nations Privacy Enhancing Technologies Guide 2023. Welcome, Julian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction, and thanks too to the BSI for the invitation to contribute to this webinar today, and also to Alex for preparing the ground for me to talk about a particular facet of the issues that he raised, namely the role of AI in the development of in silico trials. So to set the scene there and to build the contrast that I want to talk about today, what the conventional approach to much in silico computational modeling is to build a mathematically based model of something which captures maybe physical, chemical, and biological understanding of the way something operates, and then to apply well-known validation and verification processes like the V model that you see on the right there to demonstrate that you've built the right thing and that you've built it right. So the how is comprised of the scientist talking with the mathematician, talking with the coder to produce a computational model, so that human scientific knowledge effectively informs the model making process. So there is a clear chain of attribution which goes back to the human science understanding. So the question we have with the incorporation of AI in this, is it something new, or is it something that we can use the same old approaches to handle? And the first warning takes the form of remembering that actually AI is just, in fact, a very large family of technologies, and which technologies you choose to use have their own particular consequences, which is some of the things that we'll explore as we go through these next few slides. So one of the things that it's useful to appreciate is that when we talk about making a model using an AI technology, it's a little bit different from the way we make a model as we described it in the mechanistic approach on the previous slide, because now it's, particularly in the case of machine learning, it's data that drives the model making. So we might use any of the techniques that we've listed over on the right there for various forms of regression, random forest, neural networks, long short-term memory, or even agent-based modeling. But the fundamental driver, as is noted, is the data. So there is an algorithm which you feed data into, which builds a model. So that's the model construction process. The model is created algorithmically rather than being created by the collaboration of the scientist, the mathematician, and the coder. So the algorithm will indeed be the consequence of collaboration between mathematician and coder, but the creation of the model is going to be from the scientist, the algorithm, and the data. So it's human mathematical knowledge that's informing the construction of the algorithm, but only the data that informs the construction of the model. So there is a distancing and potentially a risk of a disconnect there. But on the other hand, it is based on actual observations which are constructing the model rather than human interpretations. So to pick up a really important word from Alex's presentation, the question becomes what are the factors that contribute to the credibility of AI technology derived models? And there are three things that I would highlight there, and about which there are a number of standards emerging. The first is data quality, the second is algorithmic selection, and the third is governance oversight. I'm going to look at the last of those first. So because that's actually where a lot of the international attention has been focused on how we manage the development of such systems. So how do we put governance and oversight into the organizations that are building these models? And probably the preeminent standard is the ISO 42001 standard for the management system for AI. Which is currently being proposed for direct adoption by the European Standardization Committee. Whoops. Wrong button. Right, now we're back to the right place. And because that's still quite a large standard, there is the committee that's been developing that is also making a more accessible document in the form of a handbook for SMEs to help them get on the path to the use of the 42001. Alongside that, there are other standards being developed in the 42K series, one of which is also very relevant for the discussions here today, which is 42005 on impact assessment. It sets out a process that an organization can follow in order to carry out the impact assessment, and also how to go about documenting it, how to associate that work with the ISO 42000 standard, and also other ISO standards on risk management. It's also important to point out the fourth bullet there. It says working with other assessments. This is not an attempt to write yet another complete risk assessment standard, but rather to show how to augment existing processes with impact assessments that take account of the particularities of artificial intelligence. And 42005 also provides a taxonomy of preliminary thinking on the harms and benefits that might follow. Other standards in development there are 42006 on audit and certification, and something that clearly connects with governance and oversight, which is 42105 on human control and monitoring. In addition, some complementary work from the Systems and Software Quality Requirements and Evaluation stream at ISO, looking at various aspects of quality in relation to artificial intelligence. And lastly, and we'll come back to this in a moment on another slide, there's another process standard which has some relevance here because it addresses issues to do with data quality and in particular how we manage bias within the life cycle. So then moving on to the starting point for many in silico developments, that's going to be, where do we get our data from? What does the data quality look like? And underpinning those is the 8183 data lifecycle framework, which is set out in that diagram above. And that's provided the foundation for the 5259 series, which has all of these parts, which address various aspects to do with data quality. Most significantly, part 2 there talks about measures, and then parts 4 and 5 also connect up with the issues that we were talking about on the previous slide. At the same time, at the European level, there are 2 more activities on bias management and on data sets, which are being developed by SEN, and we'll pick those up when we get to the slide about SEN activities in a moment. So the third topic then was how do we establish credibility? And the thing is that with AI technologies, what we can verify and how we validate is very much going to depend upon the particular AI technology that we choose out of some of the examples, that we had on the earlier slide. That we might consider. So some of those are quite transparent in terms of we can see what's happening and we can understand whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. So that's captured in the notion that some AI technology is simply more transparent than others. And when they're not transparent, when they're opaque, when they're black boxes, then the solution, the direction that people are researching is how to provide explainability to these systems, which means really determining which factors contributed to an output, but it still doesn't tell us about how that result was actually calculated, because the system itself is just simply too complicated to understand. And so that leads to the notion that credibility essentially potentially becomes a metric. And we see some movement in that direction with the American Society for Mechanical Engineers validation and verification work on uncertainty quantification, which is in progress at the moment. We've touched on bias, and there is this work also has been under consideration at ISO for a number of years now. I've grayed this out simply because this was a technical report which is published in 2021. In principle, the lifetime of a technical report at ISO is only 2 years, after which it is regarded essentially as obsolete. There is a follow-on technical specification to 24027, which goes into more detail on that and provides some guidance, but it's still not a detailed solution. And reflecting to the need to develop understanding and experience in this area, IEEE 7003 standard is primarily about process, where it urges the organization and the implementers to think about various questions as they might arise during the development process, but it doesn't give any sort of prescriptive answers, which is really what we're looking for at the European normal standardization level, because that's what's needed to deal with issues arising from things like the AI Act and the Cyber Resilience Act. So moving on to that, let's have a look at what's happening at SEN. There are a number of standards being developed there, some of which are simply being adopted straight across from ISO, but other ones are being tuned or augmented to deal with AI Act related questions. One particular issue there is that the AI Act also emphasizes something that's rather a novel risk category for standardization, not something it's had to consider before, namely fundamental rights. There are a number of working groups at JDC 21. You're welcome to try and come and engage with those. They're developing a number of standards. Sorry, there was a time lag there, which meant that a number of standards there which are trying to fill in those gaps. And to wrap up, what essentially the problem that we're facing is how to bridge the credibility gap that may be being created through the introduction of AI technologies in silico trials. We've already seen that there is the work that I mentioned on uncertainty quantification at ASME, which builds on their VMV40 standard. And what we're seeing at SEN is development of the risk and impact assessment to attune it to the particularities of artificial intelligence, particularly taking into account bias, viewing it as a safety problem where we want some bias, but other bias we do not want, and how do we manage all of those? How do we mitigate for them? And effectively then viewing credibility as something that, because we have a system that is changing over time, then credibility assessment becomes a through life issue. So one final thought to reflect upon as we move into the Q&A is, if you think AI is the answer, you don't understand the question. You do need to know that AI is the answer. So thinking about that question is what some of these standards will help, I hope, for you to be able to do. Thank you, and back over to Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Julian, for the presentation. This is really interesting. I want to just please ask everyone who wants to make questions to submit them using the Q&A function on the side panel. So before we start the Q&A action, I would like also to invite everyone to get involved in the standards development work if you are not already there. Becoming a standards maker allows you to shape the future of industries and technologies by creating frameworks that promote innovation, interoperability, and fairness. You not only influence how systems work together, but also help ensure that progress benefits everyone. So you can find out more about joining committees by visiting the link in your chat or by scanning the QR code on your screen. So if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us at standardsmakers@bsigroup.com. Next slide, please. Okay, so joining us for today's Q&A session, we also have Dr. Mark Horner. In his role as Distinguished Engineer at ANSYS, Dr. Horner helps manage business and technology development for the healthcare industry. He focuses on regulatory applications of modeling, clinical applications, and digital transformation. Dr. Horner is also Vice Chair of the subcommittee that created the ASME VNV40, an FDA-recognized standard that provides a risk-based framework for establishing the credibility requirements of a computational model. He's also a close collaborator with the UK CERSI project led by Professor Frangi. Welcome to our session, Mark.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions coming in, and we've also received some pre-submitted questions. So thank you to everybody who took the time to do that as well. And we have everyone here. So I would like to start with a first question to you, Mark. Considering your contributions to the UK in Silico project and your involvement with the ASME VNV40, how do you see the framework adapting to support the integration of AI technologies in a way that aligns with international practice and expectations?
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Lindsay. I appreciate it, and thanks for including me in today's webinar as a panelist. I appreciate it, and really enjoyed hearing from Alex and Julie and their perspective. Yeah. So on the AI models, it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that we haven't had to deal with yet in the ASME VNV40 space because we've been primarily focused on physics-based modeling and simulation. There is an ASME group, ASME 70, that's focusing on verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification for machine learning models. And they have published one paper that talks a little bit about a potential framework for evaluating the credibility of AI-based models. And then I'm also a member of the ASME 80 subgroup that's focused on pharmaceutical manufacturing. And in that case, on the pharma side, we are very interested in the use of database models as well as physics-based models and then potentially hybrid models because those are emerging as an important part of the manufacturing process potentially is digital twins. So coming back to your question then is, how do we see this framework potentially being adapted? I think we do have some early insights into that. There were some FDA guidance documents that were published earlier this year related to AI-based models. There was one specifically focused on the biopharmaceutical industry, and in that case, they are taking the risk-based approach, as Alex mentioned before. So, similar to VMV40, there would be a question of interest, a context of use, and then a risk assessment, and that's what's proposed in the standard. And it would be according to the model influence and decision consequence, just as we are using in the VMV40 standard. But then the next step, and Alex, went quickly through it, that's fine. But the next step in VMV40, for those of you who aren't familiar, is we do go through a set of what are called credibility factors that help to guide the evaluation of the computational model. And those credibility factors for physics-based models focus on things like code verification, mesh refinement studies, et cetera. And those are in the verification section. And then the validation section, they essentially focus on things that help us evaluate the level of agreement between between the real world and then the model itself. And so I think what we would see, getting really to your question now, I think what we would have to see within VMV40 is an adjustment of those credibility factors themselves. And especially when it comes to verification, I'm not an expert in AI, so probably Julian could talk quite a bit about this. But for example, code verification isn't something that we talk about in the AI space. There isn't a series of code or instructions that tell us how to solve a second derivative within an AI model. Whereas within the physics-based world, we have to be able to evaluate that and ensure that the code developer did a good job generating code that does that derivative accurately. So instead, in the AI space, we would be focusing more on evaluation of the data. The data used the data that was used for model training. We would be focusing on how the model was evaluated. So looking at things like data independence and ensuring that the validation data was hopefully independent of the data that was used for training. I do see some similarities when it comes to VMV40 though. So if we circle back towards the end, we do need to evaluate the applicability of the data that was used for the real world case. In that case, looking at the scenarios from which the data was collected and seeing how similar those scenarios are to the actual context of use and question of interest. That's where we'd wrap back towards the end to VMV40 again. But I think in that middle space, verification and validation, if we want to follow the VMV40 approach, many of those credibility factors would have to be reoriented towards the data and how that data was collected, how it's used to train the model, and then evaluate the model. Yeah, that's my kind of long answer to that question. Hopefully it's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, that's very helpful. So I have one for, I think, Alex now. Alex, if you could tell us what's the place today of in silico trials in clinical evaluation?
So this is an emerging area as well. So I would like to answer in two ways or two angles. One is what is the potential use, and I think that is very large, and there is already a number of scientific publications like the ones I hinted in my presentation, but there is lots of other ones in pretty much every area, from devices to pharmaceuticals, from imaging to procedures as well. So you don't necessarily need to do an in silico trial of a device. It could also be about, for instance, a radiotherapy planning sort of protocol, right? Something that is more akin to an algorithm, effectively. So there are examples out there for all of those, and I would say the potential is very clearly articulated and evidenced so far. What we would like to see, and this is kind of the second angle to my answer, is this being much more broadly embraced, understood, embraced and adopted by regulators and regulatory affairs people in industry. And this is something that we have started through the engagement a number of years ago and has led to the UK CERSI, which precisely has that as an objective, moving from the feasibility and the possibility of doing this to a much broader adoption. And there's a critical role in that to happen of standards and things like the frameworks that Mark and the points that Julian were made, because what regulators essentially want to know is that there is this thorough process that leads to a well-informed use of modeling of models in the process of decision making for approvals of medical products. And I think it's great to see that actually the community has been developing now for a number of years. I think in my slide I indicated that the first start of ASME BMB40 was 2008, Mark, I think. So there has
Well, like
been a very
2011 is when we first started. Yeah, that's when our charter was written, was 2011. Yep.
2011. So that's already a long journey to this point. And whoever is involved into standards know that it's always a long journey. But what we need to do now is go from, I would say two things. One is to enable that clinical adoption. One is to develop best practices and guidelines so that to articulate the standards into sort of ways of using them. Second, case studies, which is what we are trying to do in the CERSI. So this becomes a bit demystified and people lose a bit the fear by having seen examples. And then third, there are areas where perhaps we need to develop still additional standards, and that's what hopefully will come from those case studies as well, is areas where there is gap in standardization or in guidelines.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I have a question now for Julian. How to use in silico trials in the certification process of medical device software?
I think all of the aspects of that have probably cropped up in the answers that you've had from both Mark and Alex. It really comes down to, I think, provenance. I want to know where everything has come from and what operations have been carried out to things, data in particular, all the way through the process to the product that you've got at the end. So to pick up particularly on Mark's point about data quality, data provenance, data pre-processing, and various analyses of the data, the sorts of factors that are reflected in those data quality standards at 5259, but also being specialized to account for the factors in the AI Act, are going to be a crucial part of how to contribute to, or how to provide the evidence for a certification process. Those are going to be the sort of things that a regulator will need to see and want to assess to be sure that the process has been properly followed and that the conclusions that have been drawn are sound. To pick up on the point about code verification, yes, it's true that the kind of code that is being used now is quite different from the numerical codes and all of the understanding that we have of the solution of, say, differential equations and numerical analysis, which has been a research topic for decades now, is somewhat different from the situation we're in with the code that we're using for building algorithmic models. And depending on the technology, some of them are simpler and some of them are considerably more complicated than such systems have been in the past. So something like, yes, a regression system, we can probably carry out the same approaches as have been done for solving a differential equation. But when it comes to a convolutional neural network, we're in rather different territory in terms of what is actually achievable. So it all comes down in the end to that same word that you've heard several times already this morning, which is process.
Okay, thank you, Julian. There are a few questions coming in, so perhaps we can go back to Alex. How well accepted is in silico trials by the notified bodies?
Yeah, this is a great point, actually. And so I don't know how familiar everybody in the call is to what notified bodies or approved bodies are. So I will briefly mention what they are and the role they play, and then try to answer the question. So in the UK, at least, and in Europe, the way that we regulate medical devices is different than the way we regulate pharmaceuticals. So devices in the US, FDA does clearance of both pharma and devices, while in the UK and in Europe, organizations like MHRA or the European Medicine Agencies clear drugs, but they don't clear devices alone. They do the regulations, they do the law, they contribute to the development of the law, but then the actual compliance testing is done by organizations which are called notified bodies in Europe and approved bodies in the UK. And these are just two different ways of calling essentially the same type of partners. And they're the same companies. These are private organizations that do the testing, do the sort of the testing and the enforcement of those regulations on behalf of the regulators. So they have a critical role. And starting to answer the question, they have a critical role because you can develop a new law that embraces, say, in silico evidence, but then if on the other side you don't have those people who have to do the enforcement being aware or having procedures in place or standards in place, this will simply not be adopted. So we are working in the context of UK CERSI. We are working very closely with Team AB, which is a team of all the approved bodies in the UK. That is, I think, co-chaired by both BSI notified bodies. So the notified body is part of BSI and TUSUD, but it has representation from all of those. So we are talking with them, and also we are having conversations with the notified bodies across Europe, working in collaboration as well with Avicenna Alliance. And just as a sign of that, a few weeks ago, we had a meeting, a full session with other colleagues that are colleagues from both Mark and Julian and myself, where we actually had a full session in RAPS, Euroconvergence, which is a conference with all the regulatory bodies, the national competent authorities, and the approved bodies and notified bodies come together to develop the latest, to review the latest developments in this area. And we had a full room actually of people from this community.
Thank you, Alex. I have one for Julian. How could we use both ISO 7101 and 42001?
So, as I was indicating with in my discussion of the various activities both at ISO and at CEN, there's a desire to avoid rewriting every standard for a new technology. And so with 42001, it's trying to be an addition to existing standards, where it's focusing on the attributes of AI that will not have necessarily have been taken into account, or where it raises issues that are particularly unique to AI that would not have been considered in a standard that wasn't written with AI in consideration. So the way in which you would do it is use them alongside one another and incorporate features from 42001 where there are questions being raised that were not addressed in the other standard.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julian. I'll go back to Alex now. Before considering AI in silico trials, I think the field of in silico trials itself needs to gain traction and clarity. Do you have any advice on the type of source of skills to create more talent in the field of in silico trials? And what does the job market in this field look like now?
Sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Do I have a sense of what of cues?
Do you have any advice on the type of skills to
Of
create
skills.
more talent? Yeah.
Yes, this is a great point as well. So the short answer is yes, we do have. In fact, that's another area where the CERSI is working at the moment. I would be happy to share, as part of the notes of the webinar, a preliminary report that we have produced, working together with NAFEMS, which is the trade organization of all the modeling and simulation companies. But this is an unconcluded work, so we are still working on that at the moment. The type of skills, I think, is an interesting question because it's a hybrid between people who understand about regulatory affairs, and organizations like TOPRA and RAPS have their own curriculum development programs and their curriculum. So you need some of those skills, but you also need, on the other side, skills around modeling and simulation, which organizations like NAFEMS have developed. So they have a professional simulation engineer curriculum developed. So it's a hybrid between these two. If you ask me, do we have those skills and do we need to develop further? I would say, fortunately, there is a lot of people with those, well, at least with parts of those skills. And interestingly, what I've noted is that both in the US and in Europe, most of these people who end up working in the area of in silico trials tend to come as well from the aerospace, from the automotive sector, because there are similar related questions in those areas as well. So it's an interesting thing because there may be some mobility of skills from sectors that we need to build upon as well. So the UK CRC is trying to work on developing a skills framework, and if those who put the question would like to reach out to me, I would love to engage in a more detailed discussion about that.
Great. So one perhaps to Mark now. Mark, what is the current level of adoption of in silico trials in pharmaceutical versus medical device companies? And are there key differences in uptake?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like the pharmaceutical industry is pretty far ahead of us when it comes to the use of in silico trials. So, they're using models such as PBPK, so population-based pharmacokinetic models or pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic models. And they're using those to drive things like patient selection, identify appropriate patients for clinical trials, supporting clinical trial design, et cetera. And those types of models have been accepted for a very long time. In fact, I was once at a meeting this was a meeting that we hosted, ANSYS had organized several years ago, where we had a collection of both folks from the device industry as well as the drug industry. And a scientist from the FDA said, well, we've had this kind of idea of a modeling and simulation report since the early 2000s, something to summarize a computational model for PBPK. And for us in the physics-based modeling and simulation world on the device side, that modeling and simulation report type guidance was published in 2016. So in some ways, the pharmaceutical industry is, a decade or so ahead of us in the use of the in silico clinical trial. So yeah, we definitely see that the device industry in some ways is catching up. I think part of that is the complexity associated with the computational models that we're developing on the device side. And yeah, I think when it comes to the PPK type models that are out there, they are somewhat easier. It's typically a collection of ODEs. That could be a large collection of ODEs, but it's typically ODEs, which are much easier. And that data can be collected and informed by the past clinical trial data that the pharmaceutical industry is collecting. So I think we have some catching up to do on the device side. So certainly this type of webinar and then the work that's being done by UK CERSI and others is super timely. We really need some help in terms of catching up on the device industry side. So we'll see where all this goes.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We're just moving to the closing part of our webinar.
Lindsay, could I add a brief comment
Yes,
to the
sure.
point by
Please go
Mark?
on.
I agree with him that there is a lot of areas where we need to learn from the pharmaceutical sector, but just to also provide a bit of a broader picture, there are areas where the pharmaceutical is also learning from the devices. The new standards around pharmaceuticals are actually based on ASME BMB40, which came from the device community, but also shows how there is similarities and parallelisms between these two sectors. And the other thing is that pharma has a lot of experience in this area in certain aspects of pharma, things like PKPD, QSP modeling, but perhaps less so in what I think medical devices are trying to do, which is a more integral use of modeling and simulation from early design all the way to the regulatory approval, which I think came in one of the earlier questions before the webinar around what is the appetite to enable in silico trials as part of the regulatory test data used to verify product design. So that combination is something that the medical device community is driving forward, and I think the pharmaceuticals are are in a similar stage, I would say, to the medical devices at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That was very helpful. So we're just moving to the closing part of our webinar. So I would like, first of all, say thanks so much to our speakers, Professor Frangi, Dr. Paget, and Dr. Horner, for the presentations and insights. And actually, thanks to all of you who have joined us today. I really appreciate. And before close, we have just a couple of minutes. If our panelists have any final short thoughts, very quick, I will start with Julian.
Sorry,
You are
trying to find the unmute button. I think the particular issue for us where we are based in the UK is to be understanding of and engaging with what's happening at CEN. It's because that's the market on it's on our doorstep. We're also CEN should not necessarily be confused with the European Union. CEN is the 27 members of the European Union plus another 7 countries, of which the UK is one. So CEN is not necessarily just building EU standards, it's also building European standards. And so that's why it's important for the UK to be involved there.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Yeah, so one general point would be we really need people that are listening to this webinar to engage and support us in the process. If any of you is interested, reach out to any of us and we would be keen to follow up. And second, that the UK has a unique opportunity to lead in this area because in a sense it's like a micro living laboratory of a full country scale, but at the same it's sufficiently small to be manageable some of the things, and the partners are very close to each other, but sufficiently large to be meaningful what we come up with and potentially very influential in the international sphere. Thank you.
And Mark?
Sure. Yeah. Final thought. Thank you. I would echo what Alex is saying. I really appreciate the work that's being done by the UK CERSI and other activities that he's leading. So I definitely recommend, to get involved if you can. From that perspective, I agree with Alex that not only is that having implications in the UK, but the things that we're learning can be applied internationally. I would say, echoing, back to the ISO activity, IEC ISO activity, we do need a standard that provides international recognition and harmonization of credibility best practices for computational modeling and simulation. So if standards development is something that gets you excited, I definitely recommend you get involved in that IEC ISO activity. I think is an area where we could potentially use a lot of help very quickly. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think that takes us to the end of this webinar. Thanks again, everybody, and have a nice weekend.